I'm here in southeastern Idaho, where nearly 2 centuries ago, the Oregon Trail served as an important artery connecting the eastern United States with the Oregon Territory in the west. Over the course of 30 years, tens of thousands of people crossed over its trackways. But today, the Oregon Trail is remembered more as being an 80s and 90s computer game. But is there any of the Oregon Trail left? Join me as we search for the remnants of the Oregon Trail in southeastern Idaho.
Stretching just over 2,000 miles or 3,400 kilometers, the Oregon Trail started in Independence, Missouri, and ended in the Willamette Valley. The modern history of the trail begins with routes established and mapped by fur trappers and traders who went west looking to cash in on the demand for beaver and other pelts for use in the fashion industry. Beginning in the 1830s, the trail was developed enough to allow wagon traffic. Before long, a steady stream of people began going west for a variety of reasons. Some people went as missionaries seeking to convert the Native Americans to Christianity. Others went with the hopes of free or cheap land. Still others used parts of the trail to escape religious persecution, such as the Mormons, or to seek new lives and fortunes in the California gold field. The trail included a number of shortcuts, or cut-offs as they were known, which were advertised to immigrants as shorter, easier, or safer routes, though this was not always the case. Some immigrant trains who trusted the cutoffs spent enormous amounts of time cutting paths for their wagons, which led to diminished supplies and broken equipment.
Here, just west of the little hamlet of Alton, Idaho, is the Oregon Trail. It winds just up the hill there. This hill was called the Big Hill, as it was a huge obstacle that the emigrants had to cross on their way west. Welcome to the top of Big Hill, where the pioneers made their descent down into the Bear River Valley. And if you look in the middle of the frame there, there's a cut between the sagebrush. That is the original trackway. And if we look, we can see it swings up the hill this way and up the top. The pioneers came across the top of the hill, and reaching this point, they really had no other choice but to descend the hill at this point. Down here on the right, we have even a sharper descent, and it's a ravine there. And over here is little better. So right here is really the only point where they could descend. Now it was a really steep descent. It was bumpy, it was uncomfortable. The wagon wheels had to be locked up to keep from skidding. Men had to work in teams to hold the wagons back from sliding out of control. It took a long time for the wagons to get down safely.
We started at 6 o'clock, forded Thomas Fork, and turning to the west, came to a high spur we were compelled to climb. The distance is 7 miles, and we were 5 hours in crossing. Part of the way I rode on horseback, the rest I walked. The descent is very long and steep. Margaret A. Frink, July 6, 1850.
From Big Hill, the immigrants traveled about 6 miles to where Montpelier is today. From Montpelier, the immigrants traveled northwest toward Soda Springs. The modern highway covers much of the original trail.
This idyllic spot is home to Hooper Springs, formerly known as Beer Springs, very near Soda Springs, Idaho. Soda Springs was a favorite stopping point along the trail for the immigrants because of the many naturally carbonated springs here. It was refreshing, it was interesting, and it was an oasis after crossing Wyoming. Soda Springs must have seemed like a true oasis for the pioneers crossing the Oregon Trail. There were a lot of springs wherewith they could refresh themselves. They did laundry in the warm springs around here, so it was a real spot to rest. Beer Springs, now known as Hooper Springs, was called Beer Springs because in the 1820s or 1830s, I don't remember which, a trapper tasted the springs and said, "This tastes like beer, flat beer." Later on, Jim Bridger visited the springs and said the only reason they thought this tasted like beer is because they forgot what beer tastes like. Having tasted the springs here at Octagon Springs and Hooper Springs, Beer Springs, I can say that I can see where the original trappers are coming from. It kind of tastes like flat beer, though admittedly I've never had anything other than alcohol-free beer. So take that for what it's worth. But it was definitely interesting, and it's interesting to see the naturally carbonated water just bubbling up out of the ground.
From Soda Springs, the trail continues northwest up through the ghost town of Chesterfield, where it again turns west toward Fort Hall.
Welcome to Fort Hall. Fort Hall was constructed in 1834 by Nathaniel J. Wyeth from Boston. Wyeth wanted to get on the fur trade that was happening out here in the west. Fort Hall was meant to compete with the Hudson Bay Company, a big British company that operated in Canada and down through the Oregon Territory. Wyeth's dreams for the fort here never really materialized, and he did sell the fort to the Hudson Bay Company in 1837. But Wyeth constructed the first fort to have the Stars and Stripes west of the Continental Divide. Though the Stars and Stripes fly over the fort now, in the 1840s it was the Hudson Bay's company flag that flew over. The company flag was red with a Union Jack in the corner and then HBC. And the head of the fort was not a captain, he was called a factor. And in the 1840s that was a man named Grant. The literature says that he was a Scotsman. But Grant, being a good British subject, wasn't too keen on having Americans flood into the Oregon Territory, which at that time was contested territory between the United States and Britain. And so Grant felt it was his job to sort of hamstring the Americans where he could. And in 1843, there was an immigrant train that rocked up with a bunch of wagons, and they were met at the fort with a bunch of wagons out front. And Grant said, "Oh, if you're going into Oregon Territory, you're not going to need those wagons." And he said, "Look, the people who came here last year, they left their wagons here because, like I said, you're not going to need them to get to Oregon. You're better off without them." Happily for the party in 1843, they took their wagons with them. Now, this isn't the original fort. This is a replica constructed in the 1960s. The original fort is on the Shoshone-Bannock Reservation. There's nothing left. Even in the 19th century, it had disappeared. But this replica gives one a sense of what it was like to arrive at Fort Hall during the 1840s and 50s in the period of the Oregon Trail. The Fort Hall replica was constructed using blueprints kept by the Hudson Bay Company. Fort Hall is the end of this journey along the Oregon Trail, and there is much more to explore. I look forward to bringing you history found along the Oregon Trail in future. Please like, subscribe, and share if you liked this video. Your support is much appreciated.